Hello all, good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to this India Cloud Security Summit. I hope you are enjoying all the sessions, and hopefully you will like this particular session too. So this is again a one-day virtual event where we'll be exploring on the security aspects of Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, Microsoft Azure, as well as Microsoft Power Platform. And again, do stand a chance to win exciting prizes. So do go for it. Again, this is not just the community event, but contributing back to the society. So please do consider contributing to this noble cause. So you can see the link in the bottom on this particular screen, and then please do consider donating. Thank you. And then welcome to this particular session, which is on information barriers in Microsoft Teams. So what happens usually is that we have been using Microsoft 365 environments, and then we have been using Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive for our day-to-day kind of an business cases, as well as collaboration purpose. So we have various users who are part of licensings for Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive. We do regularly share much of the information with them. So all in all, we are using it for a good purpose. But again, there might be some scenarios in the in your day-to-day life, or maybe if you have the scenarios coming from the business, or maybe from the security implications point of view, or maybe as a regulatory point of view, that we you want to have maybe communication to be allowed or communication to be not allowed between different segment of the people. So different segment, that means maybe the person who are from the same departments, or maybe based on some kind of an attributes, right? So we want to have allow or disallow those kind of an communication between two set of peoples. So in this particular scenario, information barrier is our friend, and then we will see like how we can carry out the segmentation allow or disallow kind of an scenarios with Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive for Business, right? So that is the outcome of our session. So quick agenda for this session is that we will see what is mean by information barriers, and then what is mean by it with respect to Microsoft 365. What are the configurations needed for information barriers? And then when it comes to applying those information barriers, how we should segment the users so that we should group them together. And for those groups or for those segments, we will set some kind of an policies through which they will be allowed or they will be restricted to have communication with each other. So we'll see how we can define those information barrier policies, and then we will deep dive into these information barriers with respect to Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive. Okay, so before get started with the session, quick introduction. Myself, Nanddeep Nachan. I'm Microsoft MVP for Office Apps and Services, as well as Microsoft Certified Trainer. I'm from Pune and author of couple of books on SharePoint Framework as well as SharePoint Hybrid with SharePoint 2019. And onto the right-hand side, here are a few of the social handles to get in touch with me. And with me today is Smita.
Hello, all. Myself Smita Nachan. Good afternoon. I'm from Pune, India, and I'm mostly working in Office 365. I'm a Microsoft MVP and a Microsoft certified trainer. This is the one book where I've written it, and these are some of my social handlers by which you can get in touch with me. Yeah. So now let's see information barriers in Microsoft 365. So Microsoft 365 enables communication and collaboration across groups and organizations, and the supports ways to restrict the communication and collaboration among specific groups of users when necessary. So this may include situations or a scenario where you want to restrict a communication and collaboration between the two groups to avoid a conflict of interest from occurring in your organization. So this may also be include the situation where you need to restrict a communication and collaboration between a certain people inside your organization to safeguard the internal information. So the information barriers are supported in Microsoft Teams, SharePoint Online, and OneDrive for Business. A compliant administrator or information barriers administrator can define policies to allow or prevent communications between groups of users in Microsoft Teams.
So even for this particular diagram, which is on this deck, you will be able to see that this is one of the banking example. So in a banking sector, usually the investment banker are not allowed to have any kind of a communication with the financial advisor. So what we can do here is that we can segment those users who are the investment bankers and segment the users who are the financial advisors, and then we will not allow them to talk to each other. So in a short way, that we are restricting them to have any kind of a collaboration, any kind of a communication between those two, so that they won't be able to find each other, they won't be able to share any of the files or any of the information with each other. At the same time, we do have a HR team. So HR should be allowed to have a communication with all of the segments. So by that rule, they will be able to have a communication with the investment bankers as well as with the financial bankers. But just that we are breaking that particular communication between those two segments, which is investment banker as well as the financial banker. And later on in this particular session, we will take this similar kind of a scenario and we will see how we can allow or restrict the communication happening between two set of users or two segments.
So now let's see the situations where information barrier policies can be used. So the first one is the user in a day trader group should not communicate or share files with the marketing team. Then the finance personnel working on a confidential company information should not communicate or share files with the certain groups within their organization. An internal team with trade secret material should not call or chat online with the people in certain groups in their organization. A research team should only call or chat online with a product development team. And in a banking sector, restrict the communications between investment bankers and financial advisors. In general, communication between the sales and the research department in your organization. In educational sector, students in one school are not able to look up the contact details for the student of other schools. In the legal section, we can say maintaining the confidentiality of data that is obtained by the lawyer of one client and preventing it from being accessed by a lawyer for the same firm who represents a different client. Then, in a government sector, information access and controls are limited across the department and the groups. And in professional services, a group of people in a company is only able to chat with a client or a specific customer via guest access during a engagement. So, these are some of the situations where you can use the information barrier policies. So all of these example scenarios, and there are many more also available, barrier policies can be defined to prevent or allow communications and collaboration in a Microsoft Teams, SharePoint Online, and OneDrive. So such a policies can prevent people from calling or chatting with those they should not, or enable people to communicate only with the specific groups in a Microsoft Teams. So with the information barrier policies in effect, whenever users who are converted by those policies attempt to communicate or collaborate with others in Microsoft Teams, SharePoint Online, or OneDrive, checks are done to prevent communications and collaborations as defined by information barrier policies.
So what happens generally with the Microsoft Teams is that whenever information barrier policies are in place, people who should not communicate or share files with other specific users won't be able to find, select, chat, or call those users. With the barrier policies in place, checks are in place to prevent unauthorized communication and collaboration.
So now let's see what happens with information barriers in Microsoft Teams. So information barriers appears to Microsoft Teams that are the chats and channels, SharePoint Online and OneDrive. So in Microsoft Teams, information barrier policies determine and prevent following kinds of unauthorized communication like searching for a user, adding a member to a team, then starting a chat session with someone, starting a group chat, inviting someone to join a meeting, screen sharing session, then placing a call, sharing a file with another user, and access to file through sharing link. So if the people involved are included in an information barrier policies to prevent the activity, they will not able to proceed. So in addition, potentially everyone included in an information barrier policy can be blocked from communicating with others in Microsoft Teams. So when people affected by the information barrier policies are a part of the same team or a group chat, they might be removed from those chat sessions and further communication with the group might not be allowed. Now let's see what happens with information barriers in SharePoint Online and OneDrive. So information barrier policies determine and prevent the following kinds of unauthorized collaborations: adding a member to a site, accessing site or content by user, then sharing a site or content with another user, and searching a site.
All right, so let's take one use case for our session, and then we will try to build that particular use case. So the use case is very much simple that in an organization where we are working, we at least have three departments. First one is a sales, then we have a research, and then we have a HR. So what we will do is based on where person is working for which kind of a department, we will create a segment based on the user department, and then we will call those segments as HR segment, sales segment, and research segment. So the use case that we will build is like we will not allow sales person to have a communication with research person. At the same time, research segment person cannot have any kind of a communication with the sales person. On the other hand, HR can have communication with sales as well as with research, right? Okay, so let's see like then how we can get started with information barrier configurations, because whenever we want to set up the information barriers, there are some kind of an prerequisites, some kind of an configurations that we need to follow to set it up. So on a higher level, all of those configurations are divided onto the four major parts. So first one is configuring the prerequisites and permissions. So this includes all of your permissions as well as the licensing kind of and prerequisites. Secondly, that since we want to restrict communication or allow the communication between set of users, we should segment those users in the organization. That means HR, sales, and research, and we should be able to fix them into one segment so that we can allow or restrict the communication between those two segments, right? And then thirdly, that once we have the user segmented, we should go ahead, create the configuration, create and configure those information barrier policies to allow or restrict communication between those segments. And then whenever we will create all those information barrier policies, firstly, we will have to start them by setting them as the inactive. And then once we are happy with the configuration, we will follow the last step, which is applying those information barrier policies so that in actual we will restrict those particular users from being communicating or not communicating with each other. Okay, so the first thing here is that required licenses, because whenever it comes to the Microsoft 365, licenses is the most important thing. So these information barrier policies are included in the subscription, including Microsoft 365 E5 or A5, Office 65 E5 or A5, Office 65 Advanced Compliance, as well as Microsoft 365 Compliance E5 or A5. At the other hand, it is also supported onto the Microsoft 365 Insider Risk Management. So do consider here that at least you will need E5 or A5 kind of a licenses to get information barrier policies configured. Even you won't be able to do it onto the E5 developer license. Okay, so at least E5 is must here to get you started with the information barrier policies. Second thing is whenever we have our licenses in place, what kind of an permissions we will need. Okay, so in order to define or edit all those kind of an information barrier policies, we must assign at least one of these following roles to the user who is going to define or edit those information policies later. So that particular user who is going to define the information barrier or IB policies, he should be at least global administrator, which is the very higher privileges which we are expecting, Office 65 global administrator, or minimum he or she should have at least compliance administrator or IB compliance management kind of an role. So these are two kind of an higher roles. These are two kind of an very specific roles which will be minimum needed to define or edit those information barrier policies.
So the third one is the directory data. The organization structure must be reflected in Azure Active Directory by populating the correct user account attributes such as group membership, department name, and many more things. The common attributes including company, department, extension attributes, member of, then the usage location and postal code can be used with information barriers.
So let's take one example of this. So right now we are into the tenant where we are going to apply this information barrier policies. So once you go to that particular tenant, go to the users. Here we'll be able to add new users or we'll be able to e- um, we will be able to add any of the guest user, but let's have a look at the most of the properties which are associated with each of the users. So let's say we will take example of first user that we have here. So this particular user always has got various attributes associated with that. So from here you will be able to see that we have got certain name and other mandatory information about the user. But down below, if you see, we have job info, settings, contact info. So these are nothing but the attributes for that particular user. And then we should use this kind of an attributes to segment all of our user. So do keep in mind that all of the directory data that you should have must be reflected inside of your Azure AD. So what is mean by that? Before you go ahead, define your information barrier policies. All of your correct, accurate data about each of the user and their properties should be reflected here.
So now let's see attributes of policies. So attributes for information barrier policies. So certain attributes in Azure Active Directory can be used to segment users. So the once segments are defined, those segments can be used as a filters for information barrier policies. So for example, you might use a department to define a segments of user by department within your organization. So assuming a no single employees work for two department at the same time. So now let's see next one is the user profile information in Azure Active Directory. So over here, first one is we can consider profile picture. So select a thumbnail image for the user's account and this picture appears in Azure Active Directory and on the user's personal pages such as myapps.microsoft.com page. Then the identity. So add or update an additional identity value for the user. So for example, you can include initials, a company name. Then we have a job info. So add any job related information such as user job role, department, or the manager details. Then in the settings, decide whether the user can sign in to Azure Active Directory tenant. You can also specify the user's global location. Inside a contact information, add any relevant contact information for the user except for some user's phone or mobile contact information. Then inside this authentication contact information, so verify this information to make sure there is an active phone number and email address for the user. And this information is used by Azure Active Directory to make sure the user is really the users during a sign-in. And the authentication contact info can be updated only by a global administrator. So over here in this picture, you can see there are the users and the user details, so the name and other things. And over here, they are assigned to the different departments. So the next one is the scope directory search. So before defining the information barrier policies, we should enable the scope directory search in a Microsoft Teams. So it allows organizations to create a virtual boundaries that control how users can find and communicate with other users in the organization. So following below are the steps to turn on some of the scope directory search. So for that purpose, first, we have to go to the Microsoft Teams Admin Center. So once we are here, let me open it. So once you are in Microsoft Teams Admin Center, so from the left menu, you have to click the organization wide settings. And then once you clicked over there, the next thing you have to go to the team settings. Let it load. Yes. Once we are in team settings, then the toggle on the scope directory search using an exchange address book policy setting. Let me show you.
So one thing to keep in mind that we should always toggle this to on. By default, this settings will be off, but we will have to make it on. And again, once we just make it on, this will not be immediate effect. We will have to wait for at least one day, 24 hours to get it in picture, right? So the fifth requirement or the fifth prerequisite that we have is the Exchange Online license. So information barrier policies work only if the target user have been assigned Exchange Online license. So Exchange Online license is a must to which we want to apply those information barrier policies. Sixthly is that the audit logging. So audit logging must be turned on. So in order to look up the status of the application audit logging should be always turned to on. So from the Office 65 Compliance Center, make sure that you have turned it on. And once you have turned it on, you will be able to also search for all those logs. So probably once you go to this particular URL, compliance.microsoft.com/audit log search, if you have not turned it on, it will prompt you to turn it on. Once you turn it on, you will be able to look out for all of those logs. And then again, this one must be turned on in order to meet our prerequisites. The seventh prerequisite that we have here is the no address book policies or no exchange address book policies. So address book policies, or we generally call it as a ABP, which it allows you to segment users into specific groups to give them customized global address list or GAL in Outlook and Outlook on the web. So formerly it was known as the Outlook web app. So before we define and apply information barrier policies, make sure no exchange address book policies are in place, because information barriers are based on the address book policies itself. But the two kind of policies are not compatible. So if you do not or if you do have such policies, make sure you remove your address book policies first, and then you should go ahead with the configuration for information barriers. The eighth prerequisite that we have here is the PowerShell module, because for the information barrier policies or as well as the segment to define, we don't have any of the UI facilities available, because this one is kind of an administrative role. So for that purpose, we should have certain PowerShell modules installed. So these information barrier policies are defined and managed in the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center using PowerShell commandlets. And you will also need the Azure PowerShell modules, including AZ. So what you can do is you can just run these two commands: install module AZ and then install module Exchange Online Management. So at least we are meeting those minimum criteria to run those PowerShell modules to define information barrier segments as well as the policy. Next thing that what we can do is we can connect to our Azure AD account by running this command, connect-az account, specifying the name of your tenant. So this one will be the name of your tenant dot on Microsoft.com. If you don't have the custom domain created, you can go ahead with this vanity domain. And then once we are there, since this one is a part of security and compliance center, we will have to get connected to there by running this command called as connect-ipps session, through which we'll be able to get connected to the security and compliance part of the Office 65. And from there, we will be able to define those. The ninth and last step of this configuration or prerequisites is that we should have the admin consent for information barriers in Microsoft Teams. So what we can do there is that we can connect to this Azure AD account if you are not created previously. So here we can make use of the application ID, which is predefined by Microsoft. And using that application ID, we will give the admin consent for information barrier in Microsoft Teams. So once you run this set of commands, what it will do is it will give you this kind of a prompt wherein you will be asked to do a consent on behalf of all of the users as an administrator. So do read out all of the things which that particular app do. So it can read and write any of the directory data. It can read and write all of the groups. It can sign in and read all of the user profiles. So at least these are the three minimum permissions which will be needed by that app in order to have the information barrier policies in place for Microsoft Teams. So once you do that, just click on accept, and then that particular admin consent will be done for information barriers in Microsoft Teams. Okay. So now that let's see how we can segment the users, which is the step number 2 in the configuration of information barrier policies.
So during this phase, we should determine what information barrier policies are needed and make a list of segments to define and then define your segments. So determine what the policies are needed and considering legal and industry regulations, who are the groups within your organization who will need barrier policies. You have to make a list of all of this. So are there any groups who should be prevented from communicating with another group? Are there any groups that should be allowed to communicate only with one or two other groups? So you have to think about the policy you need as belonging to one of the two groups. So the first one is a block and allow. So in a block policies, prevent one group from communicating with another group, and in allow policies, allow a group to communicate with only certain other specific groups. So when we have the initial list of groups and policies, we have to proceed to identify the segments. Now let's see what are the identifying the segments. So additional to the initial list of policies, make a list of segments for your organization. So user who will able to included in the information barrier policies should belong to a segment. So you have to plan your segments carefully, as a user can only be in a one segment, and each segment can have only one information barrier policy applied. So determine which attributes in your organization's directory data you will use to define the segments. You can use a department, member of, or any other supported attributes. Make sure that you have the rules in the attributes you select for users.
Right. So now that let's take that use case, which is sales, research, and HR. So we already know that we want to restrict the communication between two segments, including sales and research, and then we should allow HR to communicate with sales as well as HR. So based on this particular scenario, what we can do is we should always have entire data reflected into our Azure AD. So now that we have it already, so what I can do is I can again go back to this Azure AD portal, where from here you will be able to see that we have all of the data populated for all of the users, including those departments. So we have certain users who are part of HR group, certain users who are part of sales group, or certain users who are part of research group. So at least now that we have segmented all of these users into one group. Okay. So let's see like how we can take it further. So now that we'll have to define the HR segment, and for that, now that we already have connected to the PowerShell module, what we can do here is we should run this command called as new hyphen organization segment, which will help us to create new segment inside of our Office 365. And uh, for creating that particular segment, we should apply certain kind of an group filter. So based on the attributes that are available in our Azure AD for the users, we'll be able to create a group filter. So here we are specifying that user group filter as department equals HR. So that means we are creating an organization segment based on the department of the user, which is HR. So what will happen after that is all of the users who are part of the HR department attribute reflected in the Azure AD, they will become a part of this segment called as HR segment. So this was one kind of an use case. But for example, if you have any of the other um, attribute of the user you want to make use of, you can still do that. But we will keep it simple. Now that we have defined first HR segment called as the segment where the department equals to HR, and now that all of the users who are part of the HR department have become a part of the segment called as HR segment. Okay. Secondly, now that we'll have to define the sales segment. So we'll go ahead with the same scenario. We will again run this new organization segment, name it as anything because this is just a name. So we are calling it as a sales segment. And then the user group filter which we are applying here is based on the Azure AD attribute which are available. So we can go ahead and choose the department attribute. So where the department equals sales, all of the users who are the who are from the sales department now will be a part of this sales segment. Thirdly, we will also do the same thing, and then we have the research segment created. So that means all of the users for which department is equal to research, they will be now a part of organization segment called as research segment. So when we will run this particular commands, at least three commands, we will have our users segmented into three specific segments related to HR, research, and sales. Okay, so now next thing is that we should go ahead and define those information barrier policies around these segments.
So determine whether you need to prevent the communication between a certain segments or limit the communications to certain segments. So ideally, you will use the minimum number of policies to ensure your organization is compliant with legal and industry requirements. So the first one is the block communication between the segments. So when you want to block the segments from communicating with each other, you define the two policies, one for each direction, and each policy blocks communication one way only. So for example, suppose you want to block a communication between segment A and segment B. In this case, you define one policy preventing a segment A from communicating with segment B, and then define a second policy to prevent segment B from communicating with segment A. Then the next one is allow a segment to communicate only with one other segment. So here we can allow one segment to communicate with only one other segment.
Right. So again, let us take the same use case where we want to have communication between HR, sales, and research, but we don't want sales and research to communicate with each other. So till this step onwards, we have all of the segments created as HR segment, sales segment, and research segment based on the Azure AD attribute of department. Now that we want to go ahead and define three policies through which we want to restrict the communication between sales to research. So this one will be just one way kind of an policy wherein we will restrict any of the salesperson to reach out to research person. Similarly, we'll have to get it configured the other way, that we'll have to restrict any of the research person to reach out to salesperson, and then to allow the segments to talk to each other between HR to sales and research, we will define the third policy through which we will allow all of the HR person to reach out to research and sales people, right? So in short, that what we will do is we will define three policies for our three specific use cases. So let's get into that. Now that we want to restrict communication between sales and research, and whenever we will do it, it will be just one way kind of a thing. So whenever we will restrict sales to research, that means we are only restricting person from sales to go to research, but not the other way around. Okay, so for that purpose what we can do is we can again make use of the commandlet called as new hyphen information barrier policy. Earlier we use information barrier segment, we created those two segments. Now that we will connect restrict the communication between these two segments by running this command new hyphen information barrier policy. We can name that policy a unique name, and then we can assign this particular policy to a segment called as sales segment, and then we can have the allowed or blocked kind of a segment specified after that. So we are specifying the segment blocked as a research segment, and then we are setting it to the state of inactive, because whenever we will create any of the information barrier policies, firstly we should have them created in an inactive state, and later on once all are defined, we should run the other command even which is specified here called as start hyphen information barrier policies application to make them active. Okay, so with this particular statement, what we are doing is that we are only restricting the communication between sales and research. Now let's take the other case. Now that we want to do the opposite way, we want to have restriction between research and sales. So again, we will run the same command, new hyphen information barrier policy, specifying the name, unique name for this. And then we are assigning this particular policy onto a segment called as research segment by specifying these segments blocked as a sales segment. And then again, for this state will be inactive. So now that we are restricting research to have any kind of an communication with sales. Now that we need to apply the third policy, which should allow communication from HR to sales as well as research. So again, we will make use of the same statement, new hyphen information barrier policy, specifying the name, unique name, and this one will be assigned segment for the HR. And then through this, we will allow any of the communication between HR segment, sales segment, and research segment. So once we will have this, what will happen is that all of the users who are part of HR segment, they will be able to communicate with sales and research, but sales and research people, they will not be able to communicate or collaborate between each other. So at least these are the three information barrier policies that we have. So let's say now that we want to see what are the information barrier policies that we have created so far. So we can simply run this particular Windows PowerShell commandlet called as get-information barrier policy by specifying the attribute as name and GUID, and it will list out you all of the information barrier policies which are in place as of now. Next thing that what we need to do is all of the barrier policies that we have created so far, we just have them as the inactive state. So what we can do here is that now we will have to get those activated by running this command called as set-information barrier policy, specifying the identity which we got from the previous command, and then specifying that state as active. So this particular information barrier policy will become active, but again, this will not work as it is directly. We will have to wait for at least 30 minutes for the system to start applying all those policy. So what we will do now is that we will run this against each of those three policies that we had created here, including sales to research, research to sales, as well as HR to sales and research. And then we should run this set-information barrier policy by specifying that GUID against each of the policy and make them active. Once we do that, wait for again 30 more minutes to get it reflected. Next thing is that we need to apply all these active information barrier policies in the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. So when we have finished setting all of the information barrier policies to active status, we should use this start-information barrier policies application command in the security and compliance center. So after you run this particular command, again allow 30 minutes for the system to start applying these policies, and the system applies policies user by user, and the system processes about 5,000 user accounts per hour. So definitely it will take time based on the number of users that you have and based on the number of segments as well as the policies that you are creating. Again, for example, if you want to view the status of that particular information barrier policy, so firstly that you will start by running this get-information barrier policies application status. So initially the status will be not started, and then we should wait until that status becomes completed. So keep running this command at a regular interval, but definitely it will take 30 minutes. So try it out after 30 or 40 minutes. And once this particular status goes to completed, we are in a position to have our information barrier policies applied, and then we'll be able to see how it works. Okay, so now that what we will do is we will quickly see how we can test out this information barrier policies that we have in Microsoft Teams. So again, going back to the same window wherein we have all of the users specified. So at least we have one user from sales, which one is this Cameron White. He is from sales department. We have one from HR, which is Diego. And then we have one user, which is Edwin, who is from research. So what happens now that I have logged into this particular window using Cameron White. So he's the person from sales, I guess. Yeah, he's from sales. We have this another person, Diego. He is from HR, and then we have the another person here with which we are logged in, Edwin. He is from the research department. So what should happen is now that with all of the information barrier policies in place, obviously research person should not be able to locate any of the salesperson. So now that this particular research person is a part of these many Microsoft Teams, so what we can do is we can go ahead onto these three dots and try to add a member. So once we do that, let us try to find out the user called as, oh sorry, was it Cameron? Okay. Okay, so let us try to find out that particular user. So you will get this kind of an error saying that we did not find any matches. So it doesn't mean that this particular user doesn't exist, but only thing this one is happening because of the information barrier policy. Because since we have this information barrier policy in place, the user from the research department, he won't be able to locate, search, or have any kind of a communication with the sales user. So again, I guess we have another person from sales. Yeah, we have Binaka here. So let us try with that too. Okay, so again, same thing will happen. We won't be able to get to Binaka from the research person because we have a information barrier policy in place. So same thing should again happen from sales to research. Let's see what happens when it comes to the HR. So HR now should be able to have any kind of a communication between sales and the research. So what we'll do here is just click on add member. Now let us try to search this user, which is Edwin. Okay, so now that we will go ahead, search for Edwin, and now that we see that we are able to get to Edwin. Again, we have another user called as Cameron here. So let us see. Okay, now that we are also, this HR person was able to go ahead and have the communication between sales and research. But again, this particular user, which was specific to research group, he wasn't able to do that. So again, take one more condition. Okay, let's say prior to this kind of an information barrier in policies in place, we have started any kind of an communication. So this was a communication I started back somewhere, and this user who is Edwin from the research, who was part of this particular conversation, and whenever we had the information barrier policies applied, this particular user has got out of this particular conversation. So now that you can see the clear message from Microsoft Teams here is that Edwin has been removed from the chat. And now that you can see that this particular user won't be able to send any of the messages because this is not a member of the chat. And why it is happening? It is entirely because of the information barrier policies, because we have other people here who are part of the HR segment. So obviously this particular user has got removed from there so that he won't be able to continue the conversation with the sales team, right? Okay, so that is how these information barrier policies works in Microsoft Teams. Let's quickly check how those works in SharePoint and OneDrive too.
So with SharePoint information barriers, a SharePoint or a global admin can associate segments to a site to prevent the site from being shared with or accessed by the users outside the segments. So up to 100 capital segments can be associated with a site. The segments are associated at the site level and previously called the site collection level. The Microsoft 365 group connect to a site is also associated with the user segment. Now check how to enable these information barriers in SharePoint and OneDrive. So SharePoint administrators or global administrators can enable information barriers in SharePoint Online. So you have to download and install the latest version of SharePoint Online Management Shell. And once you have this latest version of SharePoint Online Management Shell, you have to run this command mentioned on the screen to enable the information barriers in SharePoint and OneDrive. And once you run this command, you have to wait approximately 1 hour for the changes to get effect.
All right, so now that let's see how we can manage all those segments inside SharePoint Online. So once you go to the SharePoint Online Admin Center, you will be able to see all of those segments. So let me quickly go there. This one is SharePoint Admin Center. All of the active sites are listed here, and we have the segments. So even if you go to the end and click on this customize columns, you can tick these segments, but this will be only applicable when you will run this particular command set-spo tenant information barrier suspension equals false. So once you run that command, wait for at least 1 hour, all those segments should be there for you. And then on this active sites tab in the SharePoint Admin Center, segment column displays the first segment associated with the site. So there can be many, but at least one can be seen from here. Next thing, like let's see how we can do it further. So let's say, for example, let me again go back here. Maybe I will take the example of any of the other team where do we don't have this segment. Oh, sorry, this one is from. Okay, we will take this Contoso News where we don't have any of the segments associated. So let's say if you want to associate any of the segment for this particular site, what you can do is you can click policies, and here we have those information segments section. So you can click on this edit, and from here you will be able to apply multiple segments here. So again, by multiple segments, what is mean by that? At least there should be allowed communication between those two segments. So let's say if I go ahead with research segment now, click add segment. So at least research segment has been added. Now that once I try to add another segment, I just have the HR segment here. We won't be able to share any of the site with the segment of research and sales together because we have that information barrier policy in place. Now let's try to take the other example. Let's say I choose HR segment now, and then we will add it. Now that we have both the options available, sales and research. But as we select sales, now that that particular stage onward, we won't be able to add a research segment. So based on what kind of an allowed or restricted communication barriers that we have set, we'll be able to apply all this kind of a segment onto SharePoint site. Let's say, for example, if you are a big fan of PowerShell and you want to manage all of the segments onto the SharePoint site using PowerShell, or if you want to do the automation using some kind of an PowerShell. So what you can do is you can run this particular PowerShell. You can again import .az module or Exchange Online management, connect to the Azure AD account, and then run this connect-IPPS session to get connected to the information security and compliance. And then what you can do is you can get all of the segments by running this get-organization segment to see all of the segments which are available there. And then again run connect-SPO service and set this particular property called as add information segment and specify those GUIDs based on there. Again, since the OneDrive site is nothing but a SharePoint site in a nutshell, we will be able to run the same command against OneDrive. So that means you will be able to restrict any kind of a segmentation on SharePoint as well as OneDrive kind of sites. So with that, let's check the other aspects of auditing.
So after you enable information barriers for a SharePoint, audit events are available in Office 65 audit log to help you to monitor the information barriers SharePoint activities. So audit events are logged whenever there are some of the activities occurs, like segments are added to a site, segments are changed on a site, segments are removed from a site. So now let's see the site creation and the management. So when a segmented users create a SharePoint site, the site is associated with the user segment. In addition, the site owners will have the capability to add more segments to a SharePoint site that already has the segments. So the site owners cannot remove added segments from that sites. And the SharePoint site admins will have to remove added segments in your organization if needed. Now
Yep.
let's see.
And Smita, just 1 minute here. Sorry to interrupt you. You got
Yeah.
7 more minutes left, so
Yes, yes,
just
yes,
need to
yes, sure,
plan
sure.
it
Yeah,
accordingly. Thank you.
yes. Thank you. Yeah. So now let's see the segments associated with Microsoft Teams sites. So when a team is created in Microsoft Teams, a SharePoint site is automatically created for the Teams file. So within a 24 hours, the segments associated with the Teams members are automatically associated with the site. So the SharePoint admins can't change the segments associated with the site when the site is connected to a team. Now let's see the site sharing. So when a segment is associated with a site, the option to share with anyone with the link is disabled. The site and its content can be shared only with the users whose segment matches that of the site. So for example, if a site is associated with only HR, the site can be shared with other HR users only, even though that HR is compatible with both sales and research. And new users can be added to the site as a site members only if their segment matches that of this site. So when a site has no segment associated, the site and its content can be shared based on the information barrier policies applied to a user. So for example, if user in HR is allowed to communicate with users in research, the user will able to share the site with those users.
All right. So with that, few of the references, for example, if you are very much interested to go ahead and apply this information barrier policies for your organization, so these are few of the references from where you will be able to read out more about the information barrier policies, how you can segment all of your users, how we will be able to create those information barrier policies and apply them. So all of the prerequisites, all of the configuration, as well as further information is available on all of those references. So with that, thank you very much for listening us. Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to our sponsors,